Good evening. I'm Mike Duran. I am a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where I also run our Middle East Center. And it is my honor and privilege to introduce Senator Dan Sullivan. Dan was sworn in as Alaska's 8th United States Senator on January 6, 2015. Prior to his election in the Senate, Dan served as Alaska's Attorney General and is Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. Dan has a distinguished record of military and national service. He served for 30 years in the United States Marine Corps, retiring on February 1, 2024 as a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. He served in the administration of George W. Bush as the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy, and Business under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And he also served as a director in the International Economics Directorate at the National Security Council, which is where I first met him. And I remember one time we were walking together from the old executive office building into the West Wing, and as we passed the Marine Guard at the front of the West Wing, he grabbed the Marine Guard by the arm, and he said, "Devil dog." And the guard laughed. I had never heard this before. Dan told me that in a battle with the Germans, the Americans intercepted communications of the Germans, which said that the American Marines were fighting like devil dogs. So this is now what they get to call themselves. I was very jealous. I would like to be part of a fraternity of people that called each other devil dogs. But anyway, I think what you're going to see here tonight is coming from Dan. Is unless he's changed his spots, a very unabashed and completely sincere support for the security of Israel, which is one of the things that I think should make us all feel comfortable in this room. Running through the American national security elite, represented by people like Senator Sullivan, is an extremely deep commitment to Israel, not necessarily because of values and everything else, but just hardcore national security interests. I'm sure he believes in the values too, but personally, I feel a lot more comfortable when the values are based on interest as well. I won't make you agree to that, but anyway, Senator, take it over.
Great to see you, Mike.
The Senator is going to speak to us for about 20, 25 minutes. He's got a presentation, followed by a little Q&A with me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. And do we have slides up on this? I have some slides here. There we go. All right, great. It's great to be back in Israel. I want to thank Mike. There's a lot of people. Congressman Van Orden, I saw you were here, sir. Great to have another member of the U.S. Congress here. Hudson and John Walters, thank you. It's great to see you. And, of course, my friend Marty Allender, I know he's couldn't make it tonight, but he's been a great supporter, as is Mr. Robert Hertog, and it's great to be at this really distinguished gathering of people who care deeply about our national security and the U.S.-Israel alliance and relationship. Just a little bit of background. I just came out. Sorry, I'm late. Just actually, the one good excuse I think you could have in Israel if you were late. I was just in an hour-and-a-half long meeting with the Prime Minister and his team. So, really great meeting that we had. I'm here with 7 United States senators. We had been at the Munich Security Conference all weekend, meeting with a number of world leaders there. And then I had suggested to my good friend Lindsey Graham, hey, why don't we go on to Israel after Munich? And so that's what we did. So we've been in meetings. We've met with the Minister of Defense, the Finance Minister, or the Foreign Affairs Minister. We met with some of the hostage families today. We're at the Museum of Tolerance. It's been a really good meeting, or really good series of meetings. But I really want to just begin by a heartfelt and sincere sense of solidarity with the people of Israel. We know that you have been through tremendous trauma and very difficult times. I was actually on a Kodal with 10 U.S. senators right after October 7th. I came here about a year and a half ago And we saw that trauma. And what we've been doing on these CODELs, U.S. Congress, they've all been bipartisan, by the way, is first and foremost saying, we, the Congress of the United States, we, the Senate of the United States, we stand firmly with the people of Israel, particularly during these very difficult times. So that's why we're here again, and it's really great to be back. It's really great to be back. So let me ask, I just want to get a little bit of a show of hands. Any of you been to Alaska? Okay, so I'm going to do the next slide here. If you have the next slide. Whoop, you want me to do that? Oh. Okay. Oh, there's the clicker. I guess I'm in charge. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Well, we have a great. The history of the Jewish people in Alaska is a really important element of our great state. For those who've been there, hopefully you've seen it. The first Jewish people came to our state during Imperial Russia's ownership of Alaska. So, and it was actually a Jewish soldier who lowered the Russian flag and raised the flag of the United States during the formal transfer of sovereignty in Sitka, Alaska in 1867. So you have some, isn't that great? I love that history. So you have some slides there. That shows the reenactment of the flag raising. That was actually on October 18th. We call that Alaska Day now, when we got our sovereignty, and America bought Alaska from Russia. By the way, it was for $7 million. That probably was the best real estate deal in the history of the world, I would say. But as Alaska grew, so did our Jewish population. It's not the biggest population. They have a term that they call themselves the frozen chosen, which we love that term. But they are determined, faithful, resilient, just incredible part of our state. So many leaders of our state. And in many ways, that kind of determined, resilient, faithful component of the Alaska Jewish community is in many ways like Israel itself. So what I wanted to do in the next slide is just talk a little bit about, from my perspective, what we've all just been through, what you've all just been through. This is my third Senate delegation trip to Israel, and the contrasts have been very dramatic. About almost 2 years to the day, I was with the delegation. Again, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. We were going to all the Abraham Accords countries. So we went to Morocco, we went to Bahrain, we went to UAE, and then we came to Israel. Great meetings. It was 2 years ago, beginning of 2023. And the sense of promise and what was happening all across the region was very palpable and very powerful. And then, of course, 9 months later, we had October 7th and the vicious, horrendous terrorist attacks. And the first big delegation that came from the Senate to Israel was led by Senator Lindsey Graham, who's actually leading this delegation that I'm on right now. We came here about 2 weeks after the October 7th attacks, and of course, it was a very different Israel. I don't have to tell all of you that. But to just see from the promise of that one Code El Al on the Abraham Accords to being here standing in solidarity with the people of Israel just 2 weeks after the October 7th attacks was very, very dramatic. Like we're doing on this Code El, our number one purpose is to show our solidarity, standing with the people of Israel, but also coordinating very closely on our policies. To Mike's point, on our shared values and national security policies. I have this picture up here of Henry Kissinger. He's a good friend of mine, was a good friend of mine, who I leaned a lot on in terms of advice. And before I went on that trip to Israel right after the October 7th attacks, I called Dr. Kissinger. We've unfortunately lost this great American last year, 100 years old. And I talked to him. I said, you know, Dr. Kissinger, I'm going to be heading to Israel right after these attacks. By the way, I mentioned this to Prime Minister Netanyahu in my meeting just about an hour ago with him, because I mentioned this to him in my meeting right after the October 7th attacks too. And I said, do you have any advice? And it was really interesting. Henry Kissinger said to me, you know, Dan, of course, Israel's going to be in a very traumatic state, but don't forget the opportunity to look around the corner of history and to say focus on what might come out of this horrible tragedy. And then he talked to me about how he thought through doing just that. Almost 50 years ago to the day of the October 7th attacks during the Yom Kippur War. And that was a big shock to Israel. But through the work of brilliant statesmen like him and the Israel statesmen, they turned that shock and traumatic event for Israel into something over the years it turned out to be very powerful, very important, and that was, of course, peace with Egypt. So he talked about that and to keep looking out for that. And so at my press conference that I did 2 years ago, or a year right after the October 7th attacks with other senators, I mentioned that. I didn't attribute it to Henry Kissinger. I probably should have at the time in my press conference, but I said, you know, we're here, of course, to stand with Israel, but also to look around the corner of history. Whatever's going to happen after October 7th, the Middle East is going to change in a huge way. And it's either going to change for good or for evil. But if you look at the history of this region, I don't have to tell you because you know it way better than I do, a lot of positive historic changes in the Middle East have actually risen out of the ashes of major conflict and major tragedy. So I think if you're looking at what happened when Henry Kissinger talked about this, after the Yom Kippur War in the 1970s, a hopeful future was enabled in part with the humbling of Soviet power and influence in the region. And while we certainly have major challenges that remain in the region today, there's been hope that has come by the humbling of Iranian power. The Iranian terrorists' axis of resistance, Shia Crescent vision from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, we all know has now been shattered. And its terrorist proxy network is reeling. And although there's still challenges, I think Israel is more secure now, and there are even new prospects for stability and return to prosperity. So that's Henry Kissinger's lesson, which I was really honored to take in. But you know, this new security feeling, the proxies being on their back feet, Iran reeling, is this all due to American power and the brilliance of U.S. statecraft? I'd like to think my country played a role in what happened over the last several months, which we did. But the real answer to that question, it wasn't due to us. The dramatic positive changes in the region have been first and foremost due to the boldness, vision, resilience, and bravery of the Israeli people, and I want to thank you for that, and you all deserve a huge round of applause for that. You know, it's almost cliche to say that Israel is our most important ally in the Middle East. Of course it is, but I think the past 2 years have proved that more than ever. Because these positive changes that I've described have certainly helped Israel, but they have also dramatically helped the national security of the United States as well. Now, all nations learn lessons during times of strife and during times of conflict. And I'm sure Israel has learned many lessons. We talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu about some today. But I hope my country has learned some lessons too. At the very end of the last administration, there was some serious revisionist history going on from my point of view. One top national security official from the last administration in an exit interview with the Washington Post said that their team had, quote, bet on Israel and helped run the table against Iran and its proxies, resulting in a transformed Middle East. That was the quote from a senior former national security official from the last administration. My own view on this, and I was very involved in a lot of the issues over the last 4 years, is a bit different. In my view, we just went through a 4-year period of a U.S. strategy of self-deterrence and escalation being viewed from an inside-out perspective. And I hope my country has learned the lesson that such a strategy does not work. Now, what do I mean by this? Iran is the agent of chaos in the Middle East. We all know that. It remains an existential threat to Israel. For that reason, the first Trump administration made deterring Iran a full focus of its Middle East policy, with the maximum pressure sanctions campaign against the Iranian oil and gas sector, the killing of the lead terrorist Qasem Soleimani, and the launching of a powerful peace initiative, the Abraham Accords, to isolate Iran and bring more countries to normalization with Israel. By the end of the first Trump administration, Iran's oil exports in 2020, by the end, were reduced from about 2.7 million barrels a day to about 200,000 barrels a day. And Iranian foreign reserves crashed from about 122 billion to 4 billion by the end of the Trump administration. That was a very effective policy. But the last administration from day one decided to lift this maximum pressure campaign from Iran. The result, that was in the past 4 years, Iran was enriched with over $100 billion in oil revenues that they used to fund and train and equip Iran's terrorist proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Even after the October 7th attacks, when Iran and its proxies dramatically escalated the conflict with Israel, a return to the effective maximum pressure sanctions did not happen. I made a personal appeal to the former president and his national security team to do this in a meeting we had at the White House when we all came back from that bipartisan Israel trip. He would never do it. In fact, the previous administration literally ended up sanctioning the Alaska oil and gas sector, my state's oil and gas sector, more than the Iranian oil and gas sector. Now, why did they do this? To be honest, I'm not really sure. But I kept hearing that some saw the Trump-era maximum pressure sanctions as escalatory. Escalatory. Even though it was Iran that had escalated the October 7th conflict by unleashing its proxies to wreak havoc and chaos on Israel and the broader Middle East. This turns the concept of escalation inside out. Nowhere has that flawed policy been more apparent than in dealing with the Houthis. After the October 7th attacks, the Houthis, in essence, have shut down the Red Sea by firing all kinds of missiles and drones on commercial shipping and U.S. Navy vessels. I'll give you one example. A destroyer in the Red Sea, the USS Carney, took in attacks of over 100 drone and missile attacks from the Houthis. They shot them all down. Incredible job by U.S. sailors. But that was the most fire that our Navy was taking in a certain region of the world since World War II, from these guys right here. Now, we all know Iran funds, trains, and supplies the Houthis, but something else was going on here. Iranian Navy ships in the Red Sea, co-located with our Navy ships, were providing targeting information and intel to the Houthis to shoot and try and sink U.S. Navy ships and kill U.S. sailors and Marines. For the last 4 years, I had led the effort with everybody, and I mean everybody, from the President, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, CENTCOM commander, with one question. Why in the hell are those Iranian spy ships targeting our sailors and Marines not at the bottom of the ocean already? Okay? This was an enormous frustration of mine, and I will tell you, an enormous frustration of the Navy commanders for the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea. What was the answer I got? You guessed it. You guessed it. In essence, I was told that sinking the Iranian Navy that was actually trying to kill our sailors and Marines would be, quote, escalatory. Now, you almost can't make this up. But the United States has not always operated in such a self-deterring manner in this part of the world. Let me give you one very relevant example to what I'm talking about here. Some of you might know of the mission we had in the last year of the Reagan administration, 1988, called Operation Praying Mantis. Operation Praying Mantis was when the Iranians were mining the Persian Gulf, and a U.S. destroyer hit one of those mines and almost sunk the entire ship. We went to the Iranians and said, quit mining the Persian Gulf. You're putting our sailors at risk. The Iranians didn't listen, so we launched Operation Praying Mantis. Within 3 weeks, sunk several Iranian ships and blew up and destroyed 2 of their oil export platforms. Guess what happened? Iran stopped mining the Persian Gulf. Tehran got the message. So here's the good news on all of this. We've learned lessons, I hope, over the last 4 years, and I'm confident that with the return of the Trump administration, self-deterrence and inside-out thinking on escalation will be a thing of the past. So, what should be done as we move forward in this new era to strengthen the U.S.-Israeli security alliance? Let me provide just a few examples on what we should be working on. Number one, we must stay focused on Iran as the biggest threat to this region and the largest state sponsor of terrorism. Now, Iran still has 3 sources of power despite all the setbacks. Yes, it's proxies that have been dramatically weakened. Yes, it's missiles that have also been dramatically diminished. Again, all because of Israel. And its ambitions for a nuclear bomb. So one of the most important ways we need to focus on Iran is to return to maximum pressure campaign. You're already seeing it. President Trump on February 4th issued a very comprehensive executive order to do just that, to return to the maximum pressure campaign of his administration's first term. And I and Senator Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, some of you know he's on this trip right now, we just last week introduced the Enhanced Iran Sanctions Act, which fills in some of the gaps left by what was called the SHIP Act and by the President's executive order. So this should be number one. Number two, and it's very interesting because I think this is an enormous opportunity, we need to exploit the mullahs' fear of their own people. We need to offer moral support, like a tear down this wall moment, to these brave Iranians. Some of you know what's been going on with this movement with the Iranian women, over 500 of whom have been assassinated and thousands have been imprisoned simply because they're protesting the killing of that 22-year-old courageous Iranian woman for wearing her hijab incorrectly. If this isn't something we can't exploit, where 70% of the Iranian population was born after the revolution, and the vast majority of them hate the leaders of their own country, I think this is a huge opportunity where the dictators around the world, whether it's the mullahs, whether it's Xi Jinping, whether it's Putin, they fear their own people. And that's something we need to exploit as democracies who don't fear our own people, but respect our own people. During the press conference with the Prime Minister a couple weeks ago in Washington, President Trump actually started, in my view, a really good approach to this when he talked about the, quote, incredible, industrious, and beautiful people of Iran. And they are. And we should always remember that. They don't deserve the government they have, and I believe there are big opportunities there. The next area that I think we should work on is to expand and extend U.S.-Israeli defense and integrated missile opportunities. I have another bill I just introduced. It's called the U.S.-Israel Defense Partnership Act, and it is intended to just do just that, to broaden and deepen U.S.-Israeli cooperation on a whole host of military capabilities across the spectrum, and something that I've been working on for many, many years with Israel. In the National Defense Authorization Act every year, we have significant funding to make sure the United States and Israel are working closely on missile defense. I care deeply about that for Israel's protection, but I also care deeply about that because Alaska is America's cornerstone of missile defense. The vast majority of all the ground-based missile interceptors and radar systems that track any incoming missiles into the United States are based in my state. And we also have great training opportunities. Some of you know that in 2013, we hosted the IDF in Kodiak, Alaska, beautiful Kodiak, Alaska, that not only has great missile defense systems, but the biggest brown bears in the world. And we did great testing and work with the IDF on their testing of the Arrow 3. And this is another area that we can continue to deepen our ties. And then related to missile defense, I think there's a great opportunity to expand integrated missile defense within the Middle East. Now that CENTCOM has Israel as part of its overall operations, we just had a hearing with the CENTCOM commander a few days ago back in Washington, D.C., where I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and I asked them about integrated missile defense, that Israel can work with some of its Gulf Arab allies, like the Emiratis and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and others. And I think this is a great opportunity for more cooperation across the region. Fourth, we need to expand the Abraham Accords. Now, this has been an enormous area of success, a great initiative by President Trump, Jared Kushner, who have done so well in this area. But I think you're going to see something, we're already starting to see signs of it. I don't want to name names in terms of countries, but we're starting to see other countries that maybe aren't directly in this region that have already made kind of inquiries on, hey, can we join? And I think that is great. If we got more momentum, of course, the Saudi-Israel normalization is the one that is the focus. There's a lot of enormous benefit to that. There's a lot of challenges still that exist with regard to that. But other countries, I think, are going to be ready. And this is an enormous opportunity that we have that we should start pursuing, I believe, and can right now. Fifth, this one I care deeply about. We need to reform the United Nations. Right now, that organization, well, you see in an op-ed that's hopefully at your table that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal back in the fall. I was part of a Senate delegation that was the official delegation to the United Nations. So I wrote this op-ed saying President Biden, in his last major speech on foreign policy, should make it, when he goes to the UN, about the need to denounce the anti-Semitism that has pervaded the UN for decades, and also call out the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, which is Iran. the two co-leads, me and Senator Ben Cardin, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time, we met with the Secretary General of the UN during these UN General Assembly meetings and directly pressed him very hard on these topics, particularly the systemic anti-Semitism that has existed at the UN, in my view, for decades. But unfortunately, President Biden didn't give that address. But you know who did give that address in his UN address at the UN, focusing on the anti-Semitism at the UN and calling out Iran for what it is, the largest state-sponsored terrorism? Prime Minister Netanyahu did. So after his speech, which I saw, I wrote him a letter and said, Mr. Prime Minister, I wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal asking President Biden to give a speech that calls out Iran as the largest state sponsor of terrorism and the UN for its anti-Semitism. He didn't give it, but you did. So thank you very much. So the Prime Minister sent me a nice note back and said he appreciated the op-ed. But I will tell you this, we have a new ambassador coming in from the UN, from the United States, Elise Stefanik. Congresswoman, she's a good friend of mine. And I've told her, I'm predicting this, she's going to be the best, toughest, most pro-Israel United States ambassador to the UN since Jeane Kirkpatrick. And I think it's a great, great opportunity. And then finally, what we need to do is we also need to work back at home in the United States on this issue of rising anti-Semitism on college campuses. I have another op-ed that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal. Hopefully it's at your table there. But it just calls out an experience that I had at my alma mater, Harvard University, which I'm forever in fights with. But this was the latest one. I was at Harvard right after the October 7th attacks. I actually served on the board of the U.S. Naval Academy. What a contrast, by the way, from Harvard. And I was there for the Army-Navy game in Boston that year. My wife went to Harvard as well, and so I said, hey, I'm going to go Sunday morning, just walk the campus and, reminisce a little bit about why this once great university has gone so off the rails. This is about 4 or 5 days after the Harvard president, in front of Elise Stefanik, in a hearing in the House, couldn't denounce anti-Semitism, which was shocking, Claudine Gay. So I went to my old alma mater. I was active in the Catholic Church there. I went to the church that I spent a lot of time at. And then I went to this library, the famous Widener Library, on a Sunday morning. The big library in the middle of Harvard Yard. One of the most famous libraries in America. And you couldn't believe what I saw. A giant anti-Israel protest. I took that photo with everybody wearing their kiafa scarves and protesting Gaza in the middle of the reading room of Harvard Library. So I was kind of shocked. Shouldn't be happening in the library itself, maybe outside on, in Harvard Yard. So I talked to found the two people in charge, and I said, hey, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? And, they asked me who I was, so maybe stupidly I told them. And one, she said, was from Saudi Arabia. The other one, she said, was from Gaza. And I said, well, I'm a U.S. Senator. I just got back from Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And they asked me, and I was having a cordial discussion, talked about the Crown Prince and all the reforms he's doing. It was going okay, and then one of them pulled out an iPhone and said, do you support a ceasefire with Hamas? And I said, no, of course not. I don't support a ceasefire at all. I support Israel's right to crush Hamas. And I said, I'm also a 30-year Marine infantry officer, and if you give people the time for a ceasefire, all they're going to do is regroup and resupply. So I don't support that at all. And the conversation changed. They started accusing me of being a murderer, a genocide supporter. All the iPhones were out. They were kind of yelling. In that library, my library, of my of my university. So I kind of debated with them for a little bit, saying, hey, the only people who are focused on genocide is Hamas. Just go read their stuff. The IDF and the U.S. military, we don't target civilians the way Hamas does, brutally. But it was kind of worthless trying to talk to these two women. And they're filming me the whole way out. And they immediately put it on the website of the Harvard Solidarity Palestine Committee, a real radical group. And but I was told later that the IDF was monitoring that, and so they were putting out kind of social media stuff saying, we support Senator Sullivan. So this is all going online, and I have no idea. I'm going back to my hotel, and my comms team and my Senate staff calls me, and like, what the hell's going on? I'm like, what do you mean? I was just hanging out my alma mater, and they're like, there's this giant like social media uproar about you. So anyways, I wrote this op-ed just to kind of say to Harvard, like, what are you doing? Why would you authorize that? And I even said in that op-ed there, I said, I'm a pro-Israel Catholic. Imagine if you were a Jewish student or Israeli student and you wanted to come to that place to study for your chemistry final. Would you feel welcomed? Would you feel like Harvard cared about your views? So this op-ed made a lot of rounds in America, and I was told it was by some fairly good authorities. I'm not sure if it's true. It was part of the straw that broke the camel's back to get Claudine Gay fired, and I sure hope that's true. So anyways, it's great to be back. We have very significant challenges, certainly even dangers ahead for Israel and our Gulf Arab allies in the region, in my view, all centering around Iran. But we have looked around the corner of history the way my friend Dr. Kissinger advised, and I think we can see a brighter future for all of us if we stick together, focus on some of these issues. And I want to again thank Israel and the people of Israel and the government of Israel and the military of Israel for helping make this happen in a very heroic way over the last difficult 15 months that we've seen in this part of the world. So thank you again, and I really appreciate the opportunity to say a few words.
Hello, hello. There we go. So I realized it's my honor not just to host you, but to host the American Irish Catholic corner of the evening's Catholics for Israel.
By the way, just real quick on that, the current president of Israel and his father and the ambassador, just recently ambassador, I read President Herzog's father's memoirs, which are really great. And, I didn't know that he was an Irishman. So you have a very good Irish-Israel connection to one of your founding fathers, which is pretty special. He even had an Irish brogue, I was told.
The Ireland of today is not what it used to be, though.
No. Ask me a question about Ireland, I can tell you. I met with the foreign minister. I told Prime Minister Netanyahu this. I met with the foreign minister of Ireland in Munich, and with a name like Sullivan, I try to help the Irish with some of their issues. So do other Irish American senators. But I did tell the foreign minister in no uncertain terms that Ireland has remarkably become one of the most anti-Israel countries in the world. And there's a lot of U.S. senators who are big friends of Ireland who don't like that at all, and it would be strongly in their interest to change some of their policies.
They also don't remember that they got their independence with American support. They think it was sort of the EU somehow that did that for them.
Yeah, there's a lot they don't remember.
Let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, because there are a lot of people in this room that are concerned about that and working against it. What do you think the chances are that we can eliminate the anti-Semitism in our elite universities. There's sort of two schools of thought out there. One is, let's work to try to reverse it. The other one says, no, let's just create new institutions, burn down the old ones completely.
Look, I think it's I think these universities are still, as I mentioned in my op-ed, I think they're still worth trying to save, but they have gone so far off course where I think that American, so-called elite universities were once a real source of American power and influence, and I don't think that's the case anymore. And I've told the Harvard president, I think one of the most important things we can do, we're working on certain areas of legislation relating to endowments and things like that, tax-free endowments. But I think one of the most important things we can do, and I've done it, where I've told them, look, if I see a Harvard law student in terms of a resume in my office wanting to potentially work, for a U.S. senator, I just say I'm not interviewing that person. I think one of the most important things we can do is just say, look, the reason these are universities that young Americans and people from all over the world want to go to is because you have a lot of job prospects when you get out. If the word starts getting around that not only that's not going to happen, but that people like me are starting to blackball Harvard law graduates because of what I witnessed. By the way, that fiasco in the Harvard Widener Library reading room, those were all Harvard law students. I think that's a really important way to do that. You're starting to hear federal judges who are saying to certain so-called elite universities that we're not going to hire them for federal judicial law clerks. So this, to me, is a way in which we can work on that issue. I hosted the new president of Harvard at his request in the Senate about 5 weeks ago. I brought about 6 or 7 senators for breakfast, and I just was Democrats, Republicans, and I just let them go. So I think the leadership is starting to get the question to get religion on this. It also relates to donors and issues like that, but you can make a difference when you highlight it. I'll just mention one other, there's a different issue, but as I mentioned, I feel like I'm always battling Harvard. Right after 9/11, I was in Alaska. I was running a Marine Reserve Recon unit, and I just had this real anger, like a lot of people did in our country after that, and my anger kind of went to Harvard, because Harvard had this great reputation in terms of training our military over many, many decades, and in the 60s, they kicked off ROTC from the campus, and they still hadn't let it on. It was 9/11, so this is 40 plus years later. So I was kind of angry. I wrote this op-ed. It ended up running in Newsweek, called the My Turn column in Newsweek, and it was only a couple weeks after 9/11, and it was a frontal assault on Harvard about this so-called great university not only will not let ROTC on campus, didn't even let recruiters for the U.S. military on campus. And then I also went after the University of Chicago because a buddy of mine, a Marine fighter pilot friend of mine, had a horrible experience there, and we got a huge response, huge. This is right after 9/11 in Newsweek. And what a lot of Americans did is they called Harvard and the University of Chicago and said, we're never giving another dime. And that was kind of the point of my op-ed. So I think there's ways we can get these universities to get back on the right track. But when they have anti-Semitic or anti-American biases, it's important for senators, but alumni to call them out.
I used to be a graduate student at Princeton, and in the student cafeteria there was a replica of a telegram that the president of Princeton sent to the president right after Pearl Harbor. I said, "Dear Mr. President, I hereby place at your disposal all of the facilities and faculty of Princeton University. And I was thinking after 9/11, if they had written and said, I hereby give you the faculty.
Well, I mean, this is just not to stay on this subject too long, but every new president of Harvard, when I meet him, I always ask him, I said, do you know what university, with the exception of the U.S. Naval Academy and West Point, has more Medal of Honor winners than any other university? And believe it or not, some of them didn't know the answer. I'm like, Harvard, your university. I'm like, why don't you teach that freshman week as opposed to, telling freshman students what pronouns they need to use when they're talking to each other? So we need to do more of that.
But look how this is something I find very interesting about the United States. Look how seamlessly you and I go back and forth between support for the American military and support for Israel. And so I think you'd agree with me if I said anti-Semitism is anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism is a national security issue for the United States.
I would agree 100%, and I do think there were so many shocking elements of what happened after October 7th, but I do think one of the most shocking for a lot of American parents who spent a lot of time and a lot of money to send their kids to these universities was to say, I can't believe that my son or daughter has been going to a university where this festering anti-Semitism exploded after Israel was in its most perilous time. I mean, it was just a real wake-up call, and I do think it's a small segment of the population, but I think it was shocking to most Americans and a lot of parents whose kids go to these universities.
Small segment, but very strategically placed.
And influential.
They have a lot of the commanding heights of the culture. That's what's so hard about dealing with them. Let's move to Iran. I, of course, agreed with all of your proposals about what to do. But imagine you had a private meeting with President Trump, and of course, you want to tell the world what you would do in a private meeting with President Trump. But what would you ask him to do specifically on continuing the fight against Iran?
Well, like I said, I think the Trump administration, it started certainly with the president's leadership during their first term, was exceptional in terms of Iran. They did something that was really, really hard, and Israel has done it in the last year or so, and that's reestablishing deterrence. That is a really hard thing to do, particularly in this part of the world. And I'll never forget, I was in a classified briefing with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Probably all 100 senators were there. And it was Chairman Joe Dunford, Marine chairman. He was President Obama's chairman, and then he became President Trump's chairman. And this is right as we were transitioning from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And I asked them about all the soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors that were killed and wounded by Qasem Soleimani's Quds Force when they were supplying Iraqi Shia militias with these very sophisticated IEDs that ended up killing over 600 American service members and wounded over 2,000. And I said to General Dunford, who's a guy I really respect, General, don't you think that the Iranians believe that they can kill American service members at will with zero consequences? And he said to me, yes, Senator, we've lost deterrence. Okay? Think about how many, they were killing our service members at a very high rate in Iraq. I was a staff officer to General Abizaid when he was a CENTCOM commander for a year and a half from the end of 2004 through the middle of 2006. And that's when these EFPs, as they call them, were migrating from Basra and then up to Baghdad and just wreaking havoc on our military. And what President Trump did, and I talked to President Trump, by the way, he's a great listener. You know, it's amazing. He picks up the phone almost whenever you call him. But I talked to him a number of times about Qasem Soleimani, how many people he had killed, how many service members he had killed, how, we need to get the word out on that more. And the fact that they launched the maximum pressure campaign, which was very effective. Those numbers I read you in my remarks are quite remarkable, how dramatically they crushed the economy of Iran and their ability to have foreign reserves. If you have $4 billion in foreign reserves, that's it. You're not going to do a lot of training for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But if you have $100 billion, you're going to do a lot. But the Trump administration combination of maximum pressure, going after the major terrorists and killing them, and very importantly, launching a peace initiative all at the same time, to me was really brilliant strategy. And I think that's the outline of what the president and his team are going to do. They've already started it with the maximum pressure campaign. And, there's talk about, well, maybe the president's going to do a JCPOA or a negotiation. But you got to remember this. Iran was trying to kill President Trump until very recently. Maybe there still are. I was in a classified briefing right before our elections with all 100 senators. The FBI director was there, and one of the senators asked, point blank, to the FBI director, are the Iranians still, this is in early October, are the Iranians still trying to kill the lead candidate for president on the Republican Party, Donald Trump? And the FBI director looked at all of us, and said, yes, right now, they're trying to kill him. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump's not the kind of guy who does a lot of forgiving and forgetting. Certainly, if the biggest terrorist group in the world was trying to kill him before his election. So my advice would be go back to what worked during the first term. Peace initiative, being very hard on the terrorists, and the maximum pressure campaign. And I think you're going to see all elements of that, and I think that's a successful strategy.
I know you've been a big supporter of Taiwan as well, and very concerned about the rise of China. Can you give us a sense of how you understand the interconnections between all of these different theaters, East Asia, Europe, Middle East? Where does Iran fit into this?
Well, I'll give an example of kind of what happened. This is about a year ago, it was about a year ago, when we were working out what's called the National Security Supplemental in the Congress. And so I'll give you an example, Mike, because it kind of relates directly to your question. So if you remember that it was the fall of 2023, the Biden administration had put forward this national security supplemental, but they called it a Ukraine aid package. And that's what it was. It was very focused on Ukraine. And, I'm very active in the national security space. And one of the things that I did, I went to, at the time, it was Chuck Schumer was the majority leader. Mitch McConnell was the minority leader. I went to the Biden national security team, and I said, look, I think you guys have the strategy wrong and actually the politics wrong. This shouldn't be a Ukraine aid bill. This should be a bill about fighting authoritarian aggression. That's the challenge facing the United States right now, the strategic challenge, because Putin, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollahs, Kim Jong-un, they're all working together. And our strategy should be based on addressing that, not just one element of it. So what we need to do, what we should do, and I work, and some other senators agreed, this bill, which we reshaped dramatically, we took it and we said, this should be a bill to help resist the Putin aggression, but it also should have a very significant component to help Israel with regard to Iran, and a very significant component for the Indo-Pacific, particularly Taiwan, with regard to the aggressive actions of Xi Jinping in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. So that's how we reshaped the bill. That made strategic sense because that's the threat. which is the new era of authoritarian aggression, and they're all working together. But it also made sense politically, because you will get a lot more members of Congress, Republicans in particular, who some were wary about the Ukraine component of this bill, but were very strong on Taiwan and very strong on Israel. So the broader bill ended up passing with a lot more Republican support, dramatically more Republican support, than it would have had it just been focused on Ukraine. So I think strategically that's how we have to think about these challenges. And when that national security supplemental bill ended up passing, that's how we reshaped it. And I will tell you, the guy who really made it happen, who articulated it better than anybody, wasn't our former president. It was the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who really rose to the occasion and kind of laid out the stakes and the strategy way better than anyone in the executive branch had done. And that's why that bill passed with strong votes in the House and Senate. It was about a year ago that passed.
It's interesting you mentioned that's also good politics.
It was good politics.
I advised Scott Walker in the 2016 campaign. And we had those of you who don't know Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, very short campaign, not because of me alone, but we had, I forgot we have somebody from Wisconsin here, Representative Van Orden. I fought a really hard fight to get him to say when he announced his candidacy that on day one he would rip up the Iran nuclear program, the Iran nuclear agreement.
By the way, that was the other element of Donald Trump's strategy, right, which is to get rid of the JCPOA on day one, too.
So we had a very bitter fight about this, and I won, and then I went to the speech. And what amazed me, I was really surprised. I wanted it for national security reasons. I didn't know anything about the politics. That was the line. You can really feel it when you would know this better than I, when you're giving a lecture to a speech to a large hall. You can feel what really resonates with people. And when he said, "I'm going to rip up the Iran nuclear agreement," that was the biggest applause line of the whole of the whole speech. I wouldn't have thought. It would never have occurred to me that the people of Wisconsin actually cared about that. You know so. What is it like in Alaska? Are the Alaskan people? Do they care about the Iran issue?
Well, right now in Alaska, so we have one element of Alaska. When you guys all come to visit, we have more veterans per capita than any state in the country. So I would say my constituents kind of understand a lot of these national security issues better than a lot, just because they've served, and they've served all over Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, Korea, Japan. And then we have a big military presence in Alaska. As I mentioned, we're the cornerstone of missile defense. We're the hub of air combat power for the Arctic and the Asia Pacific, with over 100 F-35s and F-22s stationed in Alaska, so more fifth-gen fighter power than probably any place in the world. And a lot of expeditionary forces. We have the Army's relatively new 11th Airborne Division headquartered in Alaska. So I would say it's less about Iran and more about kind of the frontline other authoritarian aggression actors. So we just had a hearing on this last week in the Armed Services Committee with what's called the NORTHCOM commander. That's our combatant commander in charge of North America. And I had a chart that showed in the last 2 to 3 years the amount of Russian and Chinese incursions into Alaska's airspace, our ADIZ as we call it, and into our waters, our EEZ. And it's a huge increased number, and the real kind of unprecedented element of that is now it's Russia and China doing these operations in Alaska. So my state, my constituents, we are literally on the front lines of this new era of authoritarian aggression, and watching the Chinese and Russians work together, which is very unprecedented, in my part of the world, which of course is still America. A lot of times the lower 48 colleagues of mine don't always get it. It's not always in the news, but I'll just give you a couple examples. This past summer we had a joint Russian-Chinese strategic bomber task force with MiG fighters, armed MiG fighters, escorting it, came into our air identification zone. That's never happened anywhere in any part of America. Joint Russian-Chinese strategic bombers. In the last 2 summers, we've had large, one was a 7-ship Russian-Chinese joint naval task force. Last summer was a 12-ship Russian-Chinese joint naval task force into our EEZ. So my constituents are very, very aware, probably more than almost any other place in the country, given the veteran status, given that it's our men and women who are going up in F-22s and F-16s. We intercept these guys. We tell them to get the hell out of our airspace. And those are dangerous missions, too. Those are long missions. You got to tank probably 3 or 4 or 5 times to go because Alaska's so big. They're flying 1,000 miles just to intercept these. So we're very aware of that. I wouldn't say it's so much focused on the Iran issue. It's focused on the Russia and China issue. And the NORTHCOM commander in his testimony just last week said he anticipates these incursions are going to continue going up significantly. So we're dealing with this. We're dealing with this all the time in my part of the world.
But there are a lot of voices saying that the United States should get out of the Middle East. And what I'm hearing you say is that with the right presidential leadership, it would be very easy to convince Alaskans that the Israel struggle against Iran, our struggle against Iran are part of this larger effort against Russia and China.
And it is, right? When you look at what's going on, the Ukrainian, and I mean, they're all connected. 90% of Iran's oil exports go to China, okay? So this maximum pressure campaign that the president's going to reintroduce, and like I said, I just introduced legislation to really give it legislative legs. That's going to be focused on Chinese entities, primarily. That's how you do this with regard to Iran. The Iranians are literally building sophisticated drones in Russia that the Russians are using against the Ukrainians. The North Koreans, as we know, all just went to Ukraine to fight with the Russians. You know, we met with President Zelensky just a couple days ago. Doesn't sound like the North Korean soldiers did very well. So they're all interconnected. And yes, I think that people I have the privilege of representing understand national security issues. Again, with the service in the military of so many of my constituents, they understand the sacrifice and they respect it and they know what our military needs to do. We do need to rebuild our military. Again, I don't want to be partisan here, but second term of President Obama, they cut defense spending in the United States by 25%. Gutted readiness. I chair the Readiness Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. I was shocked at how our troops' readiness had plummeted. Donald Trump, first term, working with a Republican Senate, we built that back up. President Biden cut defense spending, put forward inflation-adjusted cuts to our defense spending 4 years in a row during this dangerous time. And I'm confident, again, working with the Republican Senate, that the Trump administration is going to rebuild that. We need to have a much more lethal military, whether they're operating here in Alaska or in the Taiwan Strait.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the Senator for these very enlightening comments.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you, everybody.